You have to overcome that every day and like multiple times a day as you stutter and get kind of weird looks from people. You either have like two paths in life. Either it can like destroy you or it makes you absolutely incredibly tough.
I'm excited to introduce my guest today, Tyler Kastelberg. Tyler is the founder and driving force behind Bullpen, a staffing and recruiting firm that specializes in the commercial real estate industry, connecting talent from permanent roles to freelancers. Originally from Richmond, Virginia, he now calls San Francisco home, where he lives with his wife and two kids. Right from the start, you'll notice his lifelong stutter. But don't mistake it as a limitation. Stick with him as he shares how it became a source of strength, shaping the grit and determination that fueled his resilience, not only to get through engineering school and a demanding career in investment banking, but also taking the leap and creating Bullpen. Let's start the show.
First of all, thanks for being on. Been super excited to talk to you. I followed Bullpen. I won't say, when did you guys start up?
About 6 years ago.
Okay, so I've probably been following you since 2021, maybe 2020-ish, sort of on the periphery, and I've seen a little bit of that evolution. So really excited to see. I've from the outside been able to see sort of how you guys have progressed, but I want to hear a little bit more on the inside. I want to break down a little bit more of your backstory, but for the benefit of the audience, if you wouldn't mind, just share sort of a brief story of where you started and sort of how you arrived to where you are now, and then we'll start to dive into, what sort of makes sense.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. So I started, I'll go back into like undergrad because I think it's an interesting kind of evolution. As I was in early undergrad and I was sort of choosing an actual major, I had to choose in between like engineering or a more sort of finance-ish kind of track. And I chose engineering as a function of its overall earning opportunity. I was sort of raised in a more like low income area, and I was always kind of driven into being a more kind of wealthy person. And so as I was kind of choosing majors, I saw the average earnings in engineering out of undergrad was a lot kind of higher over any other opportunity out there. And so ended up in the first 2 years of undergrad in more sort of chemical engineering, and then ended up kind of interning in that and decided, hey, I don't want to be a chemical engineer. You end up on a like oil field somewhere, and then ended up like pivoting that into a more sort of systems engineering, and that is what kind of like led me into interest on like Wall Street and that kind of stuff. I ended up like tripping over this opportunity to be in a club that ended up investing a lot of money into fixed income assets, and that was super cool. It was an awesome experience, and I had this like taste of like finance I was always interested in, and so ended up applying all over Wall Street after undergrad, and I would be in these interviews, like tripping over words. I would be, I have a stutter, as you can tell, and as I was interviewing, I could like hardly introduce myself, and all these like salespeople on Wall Street were like, "Hey, like all these like banking jobs are more kind of like sales, and it's in sort of focus here. And if like introducing yourself is as hard as it is, then it probably isn't a career for you." So ended up like taking a job in a more sort of like FP&A role out of like GE, and then transitioned into a more kind of banking role like 2 years later out of San Francisco, and that's how I ended up like realizing this actual dream of being on Wall Street. The thing that was really interesting as I got there is I kind of told myself if I was earning like X a year, I'd be happy. And at the GE, I was earning under that. in this iBanking role, I was earning that. And, I as I was in it, I was working 80 hours a week. I realized, I don't want to be doing this. And if I ended up like doing this on my own, I'd be a lot like happier, I think. And so after spending around 2 years in a kind of like iBanking role, I ended up like breaking off. And I told myself I would end up raising a bunch of money and invest in real estate. I'd started investing in real estate in early undergrad. I purchased a property after interning. I think I was interning with GE at that time, and ended up investing in a property after that, and got like hooked on real estate. It was enough. I was earning enough off the property in order to pay like rent and then a little like beer money afterwards, and that was super cool. And so I got kind of I was hooked on it, and so ended up like raising some money, and had these like entrepreneurial plans of ending up as this big like PE master in real estate. I think what's interesting though is that as I was in iBanking, as I was with like GE, I realized that like I had this sort of like fundamental issue of where I was interested in these leadership opportunities. However, all the people who ended up like promoted in these opportunities had these like presentation abilities that were just out of this world. And as a person who trips over words, who has a stutter, it's extremely difficult to stand up in a room of 100 people and present in the way I was interested in executing that at that time. I do it today. It isn't a big deal. And I stutter as I do that. And, I just had that piece. But at that time, it was almost had like two options. I can stay as this like analyst, like analytical person, and, I probably have a lot of stress, earn some money and be okay. Or I could like break off and almost like chase this sort of dream. And so to me, the choice of entrepreneurship and the actual choice of saying I want to start something on my own and chase after that is a much like larger kind of choice over the actual entrepreneurial idea. I think like ideas are out there. You can say, hey, I want to start a plumbing business because there aren't a lot of plumbers over in San Francisco, which is our home. Or I want to be in a staffing business and recruiting, or start in real estate. The true kind of choice though is entrepreneurship over W-2, and I think having kind of peace with that is a primary hurdle for people as they're starting a business. So fast forward, I was investing in real estate, and as I was starting this business, like I really hadn't at all like researched anything in this industry. I was like, I'll just like raise some money out here on the West Coast. I was raised on the East Coast, and I'll go invest out east. And as I was doing it, I realized, man, there's a huge amount of competition doing this. I thought it was only me at first. I'm like, hey, this is great. There's not anyone who's raising money in the West, investing in the East. Everybody was doing it. And it was highly competitive. So, in order to pay the bills, I would like help out as a freelancer. And so I was hired, out of a company that had like 20 or 30 people and were doing deals, and they needed, assistance on a project basis on some underwriting. I would do that. I would like help out a person that was this like 2-person team out of Richmond in Virginia. And I would do, offering packages for them. And, as I was adding all these clients on a freelance basis, I was sort of realizing like, hey, I think, there's a much like larger kind of opportunity here. And so ended up like pivoting out of investing in real estate into offering services on a consulting basis. And so as I was doing that, ended up like hiring some people off of Upwork, and I would like lead all the client stuff and introduce, help like oversee the projects, help to price everything, obviously, and make sure it had a quality outcome. And I was on my honeymoon in 2018, which was 6 years ago, and realized that like I had to work like 2 hours a day, in order to keep everything like moving at the business, or it would stop. And that was a huge problem, right? I was the kind of like linchpin. And it ended up hitting me, instead of operating as this like jockey in between the clients and all these Upwork and the freelancers, if instead I just like introduce our like high quality talent and our free and our employers, and then I earn a percentage of that transaction, it's just a much like better overall business model. And so that kind of that sort of pivot there, is our sort of launch of like Bullpen. And again, it was 6 years ago, as of 2 weeks ago. And so, the kind of like journey of getting there, it was a whole lot of like iterating and understanding like, hey, entrepreneurship over anything else. The actual idea I was working on, or the business I was working on, is sort of secondary. I was interested in effectively like innovating, and like how our customers wanted at that time. And so as we started Bullpen 6 years ago, it started as a software play. And so I was intrigued. I was over in San Francisco at that point and was like, hey, this whole software business thing is outstanding. All the valuations on these businesses were absolutely insane. And so I had this sort of mission of, I would build a like Upwork, you've heard of Upwork, but only in the commercial real estate industry. And so it would be all sorts of roles. It could be analysts, acquisitions people, it can be development people, it can be your property accountants, your IR people, fundraisers, all that good stuff on a single, online platform. I thought it was really cool, and our customers hated it. Our happiest customers ended up reaching out to me on the phone saying like, hey, Tyler, I need an analyst who has XYZ experience over in like Tucson. And then I would then hand pick someone and pass it over to them, and they'd be like, great, this is awesome. So, after trying the whole like software thing over a good year and a half, and sort of realizing that our customers hated it, we ended up pivoting into a more sales enabled approach. And so we had some salespeople on our team, and they would help like intake all these like needs, and then have these like talent people on the backside who would help like pull our talent and then kind of pair them. And it all sort of clicked, at that point. And so in 2021 and 2022, our business expanded at over like 500% a year. So we had a huge expansionary period. We ended up hiring a bunch of people, and everything sort of clicked. I'll go kind of backwards on the whole kind of VC interest. And so I tried to raise money. I'm not sure if I've ever sort of told this story. I tried to raise money, and I started with like angel investors. I wanted to raise $2 million for the business. Got to around like $45,000, and holistically abandoned it. I would kind of pitch all these VCs, hey, I am a like Upwork of real estate, Upwork of commercial real estate. Upwork's a huge business. I could be a huge business. The problem is how Upwork ended up at public was these like series of kind of like train wreck VC investments that like I don't think anyone actually earned a whole lot of money on like Upwork as it went like public. It's an extremely difficult overall business model, and so I was basically kind of pitching people to say like, hey, are you interested in like losing money with me? Like, come on, let's do it. And so yeah, that was a journey. But in hindsight, I raised 45 grand, and I don't think I've ever used it. I ended up like building it as a profitable business as a function of me kind of having to. And in hindsight, that was a huge blessing.
This is all super interesting, and I want to break down some of these things that you've sort of alluded to in a little bit more detail. But most specifically, I think there's a common theme, and I'll sort of just reference that you have a terrific Substack that basically takes us through the journey week after week of what happened at Bullpen and what you overcame, what encounters you had. And one thing that seems to be pretty evident in all of your encounters, going back even to college, is that there was an iterative pursuit. I think of Michelangelo and the David sort of pounding the rock. They talk about, when you continue to chisel away, the art appears, but you need to continue chiseling away. And I think it's easy for people to sort of lose sight of that. They get rejected. They find that they're not suited for something. There's a wall in front of them. And really there's two choices, either to turn back and go the other way or find another way around it. And it's not really all that frequent that people are still willing to find, a way around it. And so I want to dig a little bit deeper into how your engineering background ended up going into sort of finance, right? And by going into finance, you found that really wasn't working for you. And then you sort of went into real estate, find that didn't work for you ideally. You also were limited, which I appreciate you sharing, your stutter, and that limited some of the ways in which you would go about chasing your goal. But that really just resulted in you creating new forms of yourself, right? To a large degree. And that I think is really, really interesting because, what that ultimately leads to is deciding to become an entrepreneur versus a W-2 employee. And that I sometimes wonder if that is a learned behavior or if that's just simply in someone's DNA that is rooted there and there's no way that you could take it out or put it in. I wonder if you could comment on, what your mindset was as you're processing these challenges and these hurdles. What kept you driven to, I think a lot of people might resign to the fact that, well, this is my plight in life. I'm just going to be satisfied with this status quo, continue working for this investment banking. Maybe I get, promoted, and this life ain't so bad. It's not what I wanted, but it's okay. But you chose to go a different path and continue to move forward with not insignificant amount of risk, right? Because you had your floor was zero. I mean, technically you could get in the hole, which entrepreneurs always do in some way or other, but you climb out of it and you end up making a profitable business. So broad strokes, we'll sort of go into each of these more individually, but I'm interested in how you came to view life in that way that was spirited and resilient.
I think resilience is the absolute key there. And I think having a impediment, in your voice, in your speech from an early age, I can't tell you how many times I'd introduce myself or try to. I'd get stuck and I'd have an adult say, hey, did you forget your name? I was in a meeting in GE with a chief financial officer of something, and we're all like introducing ourselves in a circle. And I always knew that introducing myself was harder than saying anything else, to be honest. And as we're at this table and it's approaching me, I mean, my heart rate, I think, was absolutely like through the roof. And I remember it ends up landing on me. I try and introduce myself, completely block. I can't get anything out. And this the CFO says, in a kind of joking way, hey, did you forget your name? Which I've heard hundreds of times. Now, it's not a malicious attack. They don't have any idea I have a stutter. And I stop and say, oh no, I'm sorry, I have a stutter. And she goes completely pale, like there goes my career, gone. Which no, it was like totally fine, like isn't a big deal at all. This has happened. However, I think on the resilience piece, if you have a stutter or any kind of chronic illness, you have to overcome that every day and like multiple times a day as you stutter and get kind of weird looks from people. Like that is a you either have like two paths in life, right? Either it can like destroy you or it makes you absolutely incredibly tough. And I think the key, as I chose entrepreneurship, like there just isn't an option of like failure in that. It was like I don't. You just. I think the only way of truly I think like ending an entrepreneur is quitting. And I wasn't going to quit. And so I knew at the start there's not any way that I end up failing. It could take 30 years, but like I will find a way. And I think that kind of core and the resilience, it was a function of the stutter since I was, 3 or 4 years old.
Did any of that resilience come from your family? How did you come to develop that? I mean, obviously the stutter has a significant component, but I would argue, I've encountered some who've had stutters and they haven't chosen the same path you have, which is to continue to confront it and to a large degree own it and sort of put it in front of you rather than, hiding it in a closet. How did you develop those skill sets? I mean, is that something innate, you think? Is that nature or nurture?
A great question. So my dad is a dreamer. He's in real estate, has been a broker on the residential side his whole life, and was absolutely a dreamer of like he always wanted to just like hit it out of the park. And he had years he did, and he had a lot of years he absolutely just like didn't. And I think that his as a dreamer, I think he sort of passed that over to me. It's like I wasn't ever okay with being kind of mediocre, in really anything. And it really, it sort of came out as I was playing like volleyball or early in like high school, and ended up like hyper competitive with that. Almost played in college. And I remember kind of like early on, I'd be like jogging around the track, out of like 8th grade, hugely overweight, had like man boobs. And I just heard our old school, a trainer from all the way across the track. He goes, "Holy smokes, Kastelberg!" But in other words, "You're fat as hell." And I'm like, I respond like well to that though. I don't think others do. And so like, I don't know. I'm not sure if it was in my DNA. I find that kind of hard to believe. I think I was in an environment in which there was always some financial hardship in our family, and my dad was always like dreaming of the opportunities of the future, and I think I inherited some of that.
So I think that's a unique characteristic that we get to see the positive outcomes of people with that, but we don't really see those that don't carry that. So I think it's important to highlight that while that might be something related to nature, there is some nurture there that you have to feed that beast, because I don't think many people would. You mentioned athletics, right? I mean, I think athletics does tend to weed out people who don't respond to that type of reinforcement or criticism, and that's pretty soft criticism. Yeah, but when you get into the real world, the criticisms are what they are. And, I think it's a microcosm of what you encounter, especially as an entrepreneur, because I think it's fair to say you get more no's than you do yeses, certainly at the onset. And being able to battle that and continue to sort of move on, that's a learned behavior, and it requires discipline. And so, following this theme of sort of resilience and identifying a hurdle and sort of moving around it, and I do want to keep the stutter as sort of a topic on this particular subject that I'm about to bring up. But you found a way to effectively communicate through your Substack and your newsletter, and it's very well written. It's transparent. It's honest. It's you've taken into account votes from your audience members on how to tailor those newsletters to become more informative. Tell me a little bit about your experience as a writer, and incorporating that into your personal brand, and how that's, what has been your response to the newsletter and to your Substack? How has that helped to shape you in negative or positive ways as you and Bullpen have continued to grow?
Yeah, that's great. So as I was starting Bullpen, there was a whole lot. There was a big kind of movement around kind of content attention, and that's still I think true. I think having attention as an entrepreneur is a absolutely valuable asset. There's a whole lot of people who could do a lot of podcasts. I don't do a lot of podcasts. I enjoy it. It just isn't a venue in which, with the stutter, like, you always come off like a rock star, right? And so I started writing, as I was launching, each of my businesses, or I guess like early, each of my businesses is actually, as I was investing in real estate and then consulting and out Bullpen, I started, to write as a way of trying to get some attention onto all the things I was doing. And I think it was a really awesome avenue to especially with like social media and on things like Twitter, to help to kind of drive a little bit of our traffic in the early days. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. However, I think if you can communicate either with like writing or over audio or with a video in a compelling way that is like vulnerable and allows you an opportunity to have a connection, that is with either, a customer or an advocate of you and your business. I think it's a really, really, really valuable opportunity for you. So I don't know if I answered your question there.
I think there's two things that I think of. One is, to your point about sharing the vulnerability. While we have never used Bullpen services, we did consider it for some time. The need for it sort of went away. But even though our group was never qualified as a customer for you guys, I became a fan because of that vulnerability, right? I started to know you, and it seems really easy to understand that on a scale like that. A lot of people, to get to know you, you don't need to get to know them at the same tempo, but it builds trust to some degree, right? But then I think the second, which might even be more valuable, is that it really sort of articulates your ability to synthesize. I mean, some people reflect on past occurrences more than others, but the ability to distill it into something that is, first of all, at least enjoyable to read, but secondly, informative, it is a skill set that doesn't come easy to everybody. And it is something that, needs to be worked on, right? That doesn't, even if you have a knack for communicating, your first newsletter and your 100th newsletter are going to be of a different caliber, regardless of who you are.
Yeah, no, I've written at this point hundreds of pieces, at the very least on a weekly basis over the past 3, 4, 5 years. And I would say that absolutely over time, it improves. And I think if you end up with train wrecking in the early days, I don't think anyone has any kind of memory of that. As anything with like social media or anything you do ends up like turning over ultra quickly. That it's easy to try something and then end up kind of falling on your face, and then in like 2 days, it just doesn't matter.
That's such a good point, because I think people forget that Mark Wahlberg was a rapper and underwear model, and now he's, a powerhouse entertainment mogul, and so that doesn't really dawn on them. Or we see Snoop at the Olympics and forget that he was a gangster rapper, but he's being photographed and has a show with Martha Stewart, which it's very easy to forget the first iteration of all of ourselves. So I think that's an important fact. But talking about iterations, if you can, I'm really interested to hear sort of your pivot points within Bullpen, right? So you started out as an Upwork for real estate, but that sort of evolved into something a little bit more nuanced. You identified what wasn't working, you retweaked it, and found new pathways to make it more successful. I'm wondering if you can weigh in on that, but also include sort of how you started to tap into institutional type clients, because it sounds like, from what I've read on your Substack, that those institutional clients are it's sort of the Paredes principle, right? That's probably driving a very limited number of clients are driving the largest number of your revenue, or a larger percentage of your revenue. Talk to us about that iteration, what those pivots were, and what it ended up maturing, and how the institutional players had a role in that.
Yeah, definitely. So there's been a few iterations of our business. Our first huge one, it was this Upwork of real estate, and we kind of like turned off the whole job posting kind of like operation, and that sort of funneled people into our sales team. I think it's very easy to end up like married into an idea or a concept of yours, and I think like realistically, you just have to figure out if your customers like it or not. As we iterated into a more sales enabled approach, the quality of our customers ended up like 10xing almost overnight. And as you sort of move up this like food chain of your customers in the commercial real estate industry, you see there's a huge amount of these tiny customers, and they're stellar. There are these 2-person teams, and they're working on deals. The upper like 2% of the companies though in real estate, they have all the money. And so as a person offering any service, if you can end up in that upper like echelon of your client base, it's just a lot easier to make money, if we're being honest. And so all of our iterations over time ended up like moving us kind of like upstream, and it was a more attractive offering to a lot like bigger companies. And so in the early days, it was all software based, and then we ended up like adding like individuals on the sales side. And then our next like iteration, as we added people on the sales side, I would still assist with people if they had a project that was like 3 hours long and they needed some help. And so we'd help like pair someone on these kind of tiny projects. That was a train wreck of our profitability and of our like effort. And so we ended up adding a retainer in our process that's at least 40 hours of work at the start. And that ended up like leveling up our customer our attractiveness into sort of larger customers, and that it started sort of painting us as a premium offering. Then at the end of 2022, I had a whole lot of customers in the past, from 2020 to 2022, and they'd say like, "Hey, I need assistance on a full-time basis here, Tyler. Is there any interest in assisting on the placement of a full-time, analyst or property accountant or something like that?" And I would always pass on it. Well, in early 2023, as everything was sort of slowing down, and I was asked again, "Hey, could you assist on a full-time basis?" I said, "Absolutely. We're happy to figure this out." And so we ended up kind of, kind of like iterating our offering again. It was only placements on a contract basis. We had this like pool of talent over 4,000 people, and ended up like iterating again into offering search on a full-time basis. And that, for all of last year, we were iterating exactly like how we would do that. However, if you look like today, it's about like half our business. And how we do that though, and how we're effectively like iterating our technology to assist like on that'll offer us an ability to do placements, of like higher quality, over a period of time that is like 2 to 3 weeks, and not 2 to 3 like months, which is average, and at around like half the cost of other like agencies out there. And so all these sort of changes and iterations on our product and offering is sort of is sort of moving us up into these like larger businesses and entrenching us in the commercial real estate industry as the sort of talent, I guess, like hub of the industry, you could say.
So what's super fascinating is how you've pivoted along the way. And you mentioned sort of the last couple of years, which for anybody in real estate, certainly, but any industry utilizing any form of debt, it has been a more challenging environment to operate in. How did you sort of navigate that? And I want you to incorporate, because there's one Substack entry that caught my eye, which is entitled "When Times Get Tough." And there's 5 bullet points you list in there, all being very informative. But the first was talk to new mentors and coaches. And in it, I can sort of relate to this. I've had several coaches and mentors, paid and otherwise, in my life. But there is a natural time of diminishing returns on mentorship. And there is a time where you got to sort of restock the stable with some new talent and some new opinions. And you can't, sometimes maybe a trainer you're using is the right trainer for 10 years, but sometimes they run their course, and you're looking for just some new blood and some new perspective. You mentioned Dan Faber from Lucian as one of the coaches you brought in. I want to hear a little bit about what you found in this process, how you're finding the coaches, what role they've had, and how that helped to develop strategies to navigate sort of the more choppier waters we've encountered over the last couple of years.
Yeah. So I've always approached innovative way. So instead of like looking at how all the companies are doing it and then sort of copying it, I'd ask myself, well, if I was like truly innovating in this space and there weren't any competitors or anything, how would I solve this problem? And the thing I found a few years ago is there is a lot of wisdom in how these like publicly traded companies are placing people on a full-time basis or on a contract basis, how their contracts work. And so I ended up introduced to a person who assisted us in 2021, 2022 on the business model. I had a really kind of a hard time like figuring out our like unit economics. I talk about that often as well. You know, our commissions with our salespeople, our profitability on our placements, and to have that conversation with someone who had I think he had like 2 exits in the past. It was he exited his first business to a large PE company. I think it was like KKR, and then he ended up like IPOing a business in staffing and recruiting. To just, you know, sort of like pitch him our problems, and, you know, he could then like highlight a few places I should be looking at, and then offer some advice. And that ended up like, you know, I think like jumping our operations and our business like years in advance of us like iterating and sort of like figuring it all out on our own. And so I think on the coaching side, to have a person who has, you know, is like 10 years in the future of you is extremely valuable. And you know, the over like value of a coach, I think like ebbs and sort of flows. And I think like hiring one over a few months, over 6 months, over 7 months, and then you know, sort of, and then implementing it on your own over the next year or so, and then asking other questions out, you know, to other people is extremely valuable.
So as we start to bring this in for a landing, I want to ask some more broad stroke questions about, you know, reflecting on sort of the last several years and building Bullpen. If you were to go back to yourself, you know, exiting college and entering, you know, iBanking at that point, and then the second point when you decided to start Bullpen, is there anything you'd advise your younger self to approach it differently, to do anything differently, to consume different content, to sleep differently, to eat differently? Any advice you would give to your younger self?
Yeah, so I think I spent a whole lot of years, and I was thinking that to own real estate and have like financial, you know, autonomy was like everything. And I think that was completely wrong. I think pursuing stuff of interest, especially as an entrepreneur or a person who is sort of inclined into starting something, I don't think you should be like married into a industry or a way of doing things. I chose chemical engineering. It was actually funny. On all of these like engineering options, there was a big like list and everyone's entry level earnings. And on top was like chemical at that time. It was like 80 or 90K. And then on the bottom was like software engineering. On the very bottom at like 50K or something. And I recall that I took like software classes, and they were easy to me. They, you know, the whole logic patterns and everything. I was like, man, this is easy. And there were a ton of other engineers who were like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. I hate this class. And in like hindsight, if I had done like software engineering, I think the opportunities just in like tech and as an entrepreneur of like starting something, I ended up like building out our actual platform in our business, and I ended up like teaching myself how to code. I think if early on I had like chased, you know, the interest I was having in like software in place of like chasing like income or that like potential income, you know, I don't, you know, it would be interesting how things evolved from there. I think starting a company, I have been pretty good about iterating instead of quitting. However, there were indicators of like iterations I was doing that like they were probably going to fail. The whole kind of software experience in the first like 3 months, you have a pretty good idea if the software will end up adopted or not. I have a lot of conversations with people who are starting a like underwriting like software business. There's a ton of people, who have tried this and they've all failed, or they're extremely tiny. And they try and iterate and spend like years and years and years and years. And I think the kind of truth is that, customers like don't actually care about that. It's like they're interested in underwriting. I think actually like underwriting in a tool as Excel is almost like cathartic for people. And so like to put it in a like app that then has restrictions on like how you do it, isn't going to work for people. And there are people who just get so stuck and spend like years and years and years and resources instead of like realizing as they try something it isn't going to work and then iterate. I think I've fallen trapped to that as I was building a software, be like Upwork or real estate, and I wanted to be a software company. I stayed on that for too long. And I think that as an entrepreneur, the people who have the humility to iterate as they can tell things aren't going well, end up like winning a lot faster.
I think that's great feedback. Is there any book or movie, podcast, lesson, online or otherwise, that has been particularly beneficial to your development?
Yeah. So All In is a podcast. I love it. Yeah. And I think as an entrepreneur, you hear how other individuals like process actual problems and the stuff like happening on the planet, and it kind of like takes you out of your like everyday kind of problems in your business that aren't huge in nature. And they're like, oh, I've got a problem in accounting I have to fix, or I've got this issue on the app I have to fix, and you start to kind of sort of like see things from a more kind of a global like perspective, and then ask yourself as leader of your business, hey, are there other things I ought to be kind of like doing, to try and sort of capture this like trend or this sort of global opportunity. So I think All In has been great. Highly recommend that for anyone who wants to. Yeah, it's great. Really good.
Great feedback. What would be the best way to get a hold of you if anyone wants to get in touch, and who are you most interested in hearing from?
Yeah, so I think,
and we'll include it in the show notes too as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll send over an email address for you to put in there. However, on LinkedIn, that's a stellar place. I post almost every day. I'm adding videos now, which is a new thing for me. It's a lot of fun, and interested in anyone like hiring would be great. And if you want assistance on hiring, I'd be stoked to help you out. And two, any other entrepreneurs interested in just conversations about how to start something and the problems of a startup. It's a lot of fun to have those conversations.
Excellent. Any closing thoughts before we sign off?
I think we covered it. I think like resilience is the true X factor in entrepreneurship. And I think that, the trick in entrepreneur is you just have to iterate until something works, and you have to be in the game. You just have to stay in the game.
Great advice. Thank you so much for being on. This was super informative. Really appreciate you sharing your journey with us and being so vulnerable in the process.
Yeah, for sure, Marcus. This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for the chat.